Yep, we're off. Right, evening everyone. It is Tuesday the 22nd of February. 22nd? That doesn't sound right. 23rd. I was one off. Right, definitely going to try and get two tonight. Had no success in the last couple of nights, basically because my youngest daughter has decided that she wants daddy to put her to bed rather than mummy, which means that I've had to shoot off and get her to sleep. But she's been asleep for about an hour. I've managed to get the dog for a walk. My wife is actually hard at work painting a wall at the moment because she's much better at painting than I am, and it feels like everything's covered in dust because we've just sanded our floors downstairs, doing some work on the house, and it just feels like everything is just covered in dust. So if the two that I'm going to have tonight are if I start saying that they taste very woody and very dusty, it's probably not the whiskey itself, it's probably the crap that's flying around in the air that still needs to settle so that we can hoover and dust. Anyway, continuing our run of bourbons, Maker's Mark was cut short last night, but I think I managed to get across that it was disappointing. It was quite a hot whiskey, and it was a little bit too fiery. Really nice on the nose, but nothing there on the palate. So the next one I'm going to have is this one here, which is probably the best-selling bourbon in the world, certainly in Europe and probably in America. Now, we'll get onto Jack Daniel's later on, but Jack Daniel's isn't the biggest-selling bourbon in the world because it isn't actually considered a bourbon. We'll cover that ground later on, but Jim Beam is categorically the world's best-selling bourbon. Now, this again is a Kentucky straight bourbon, so it's straight bourbon aged for a minimum of 2 years. Now the distillery is in Claremont, Kentucky, and I'll put a map up now of where Claremont is. Now the Jim Beam is prides itself on the fact that it's been under ownership of the same family since it started in 1795. Apart from a brief break where Prohibition kicked in, and obviously they couldn't make it on. Now Jim Beam, the Beam family are actually German immigrants that came over to America in the late 18th century, and they were called the Boehm, B-O-H-M, and they basically anglicised their surname to Beam. Now Jim Beam is a guy called James B. Beam, who reopened the distillery in 1933 after the end of Prohibition, and his family had run the distillery prior to that. It closed because of Prohibition. He essentially kind of rebuilt it and relaunched it, and then carried on as they were before. So it's a classic bourbon in terms of it's a combination of corn, rye and barley. Obviously more than 50, it has to be at least 51% corn in order to be bourbon. You're looking at about 15 to 20 quid a bottle. It's prevalent everywhere. Now they've got a couple of other different versions. Now Beam itself as a company were pretty big, but they're now owned by Suntory. And there is a subsidiary now called Beam Suntory. Now Suntory have basically acquired all the debts in it was about 2013, because Beam were a big company but they were struggling. They were also part of a company called Fortune Brands, which renamed itself as Beam Inc. And then Suntory purchased Beam, and it's now part of them. Now Suntory also owned Maker's Mark. So we'll see what this is like, because obviously everybody who's had whiskey has probably had this at some point. Really sweet on the nose, almost artificial. It's pleasant. It's certainly not as rich as the Maker's Mark was yesterday, and it's not as rich as a lot of bourbons. Not what I, as a bourbon drinker myself, tend to associate with bourbon. The richness isn't quite there. There is a sweetness, there is a fruitiness, but it's not particularly deep. It's standard 40%, certainly is a standard 40%. Now straight away, there's I'm saying, having said, dusty and loads of stuff going on in the house, but there is a woodiness there, and it is the whiskey. It's not all the dust in the air. It's quite light. There's not a great deal of richness in there, but as soon as it hits your tongue, there is a a definite woody dryness to it, and then this sweetness comes through. There's not a great deal to it. There's not a huge amount on the finish. There's nothing wrong with it per se, but there's nothing that particularly stands out. There's nothing that really jumps out in terms of richness or complexity, and it is quite dry. Not an unpleasant dryness, but you can see why a lot of people will be drinking Jim Beam and Coke rather than Jim Beam neat, and a lot of people will be adding ice to it as well, because you need the. Now, personally, I hate ice in whiskey. Full stop. If you need it colder, personally speaking, I would put the bottle itself in the freezer, and then pour straight from the freezer. But you need that ice effect, or you need that chill to sort of take that edge off, because at room temperature, on its own neat, there is a dry woodiness to it that, like I say, is just not unpleasant, but it's difficult to I'm really struggling to describe why, because it's not doing anything for me. It's not giving me any enjoyment particularly, but it's not horrible. It's not difficult to drink like some of the previous ones that I've had, where there's been that woodiness in, and it's actually been quite a chore to drink it, and there is very, very little on the finish. It's not quite metallic, but there is an edge to it, and it reminds me of grain whiskies particularly, and obviously grain content in blended whiskey, blended Scotch, you can really pick up this kind of edginess to it, and that's prevalent in there. So I'm willing to bet that there's quite a bit of rye in this as well. Like I say, I can see why it's really, really popular, and I can see why it's big in mixing and cocktails, but as a neat bourbon to drink, yeah, it's not fantastic, to be perfectly honest. And I would certainly say for the price, there are better whiskies out there. And if you like bourbon, there are better Scotches that have more complexity than that Jim Beam. So yeah, it's always good to kind of go back to the ones that are the big sellers, because you end up forgetting about them and you sort of move on and you expand your horizons. But it's good to see what the kind of entry level ones are like. Not great, not horrible, but just very, very middle of the road. So the next one is actually linked to the Jim Beam as well. In fact, the next 4 are linked to Jim Beam, which might give you a bit of a clue if you know anything about Jim Beam and bourbons. So I'm going to rinse everything out, rinse my mouth out, and then we'll crack on with the next one. See you in the next one.